Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In chapter 15 of his masterwork, Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes is going to make a declaration about the true and only moral philosophy. Now, what does he mean by that? As it's going to turn out, his own moral philosophy, which is being put forth in Leviathan, offered to rulers as something which they can both be guided by and also impose upon their subjects. Lacking this, we're going to be stuck in conflict forever. And we want to back up a little bit, because what is the true and only moral philosophy concern? Well, what we call the laws of nature. Not a completely new idea, goes all the way back, possibly to Aristotle, depending on how you're reading him, and definitely to the Stoics, playing a major role within medieval philosophy and then in early modern philosophy, where Hobbes is going to transform it into something quite a bit different. And so chapter 14 and 15 are going to do several things. One of them is to identify what the laws of nature actually are. There's several at the very start that get a lot of discussion, and then he goes through the rest of them. And he's going to explain each of them and why it's actually a law of nature. So what is a law of nature? Well, he's going to tell us that it's a precept or a general rule, so something that's binding on all of us, which is found out by human reason, a capacity that Hobbes says that we all possess, actually once we're of age, forbidding what is destructive of one's life. So if you can avoid being in a condition of war, well, then you should get out of that condition of war, because war is destructive to your life. If we think about the other laws of nature, don't do things that are going to make you noxious to everybody else. He's got one where he explains it by using a metaphor of stones that are being put together in a wall. If they don't fit into the wall, they're going to throw the stone aside. And similarly, for people who don't fit into the rest of society, complacence or getting along with other people is one of those laws of nature. But there's others that have to do with gratitude or with justice or other things like that. So forbidding what is destructive of one's life, or taking away the means of preserving one's life, which often depend on other people in society, or to omit, that is, to leave out what one thinks will best preserve one's life. So you could see these as, overarching norms and guidelines for how to keep yourself alive, how not to do dumb things that will take away the means to keeping yourself alive, and to do the things that you need to do in order to, have a continued existence. And we could even go further and talk about having a decent existence. But Hobbes is mostly focused on that. And then he tells us a few other things. So he's got these Latin expressions. He says that they oblige us in foro interno, not in foro externo. So interno is our, interior. So the realm of our desire, we can recognize, I want to do these sorts of things. I want to live this sort of way. I want to be this kind of person. But that doesn't necessarily oblige us yet to putting these into action or practice. Something else is going to be needed, and that is what he calls the establishing of a commonwealth and a sovereign, an authority who has the power of life and death and can compel us to do these things. So he gives an explanation here. He that should be modest and tractable and perform all he promises in such time and place where no man else should do so would make himself a prey to others and procure his own certain ruin, contrary to the ground of all laws of nature, which tend to nature's preservation, right? So what we need is something that is going to bind us inforo external, and we'll get to that in just a bit. And then he tells us one other very interesting thing before we get to the talk about, this science. He tells us that the laws of nature are immutable and internal. Why? Well, what does that mean to begin with? Immutable, cannot be changed. Eternal, apply throughout all time for Hobbes, because there's no notion of eternity as something like transcending time for Hobbes. Why? Injustice, ingratitude, arrogance, pride, iniquity, exception of persons, that is, giving some people greater priority than others, and the rest can never be made lawful. It can never be that war shall preserve life and peace destroy it. And you might say, well, wait a second. If I fight against somebody, that's being in a state of war, and I could save my own life with self-defense. Yes, that's quite true. Hobbes is talking in general. So all of these, and notice that he's been talking about qualities here that are displayed in desire and action. All of these are things that fit the bill for, keeping us from doing what's destructive to our life. They help to preserve the means that are needed for life and all of that sort of thing. So he's going to go on and say, the same laws, because they only oblige only to a desire and endeavor, are easy to be observed. They require nothing but endeavor. He that endeavoreth their performance fulfills them, and he that fulfill the law is just. Now, endeavor means, to desire in this case, right? And then he goes on, and here's where we get to the real crux. The science of the laws of nature, he says, is the true and only moral philosophy. And now he's going to explain this. Why is that the case? What is moral philosophy? Nothing else but the science of what is good and evil. And now we get to the first seeming paradox. So he goes on and explains. Good and evil in the conversation and society of mankind. Good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which in different tempers, customs, and doctrines of men are different. And diverse men differ not only in their judgment on the senses of what is pleasant and unpleasant to the taste, smell, hearing, touch, and sight, but also what is conformable or disagreeable to reason in the actions of common life. The same man in diverse times differs from himself, and at one time praises that is calls good, another time he dispraises and calls evil, and this leads to disputes, controversies, and at last war, right? And so if our, what he calls private appetite is the measure of good and evil, we're always going to be in a state of war. So what the hell is the science of, good and evil then? It seems like it's the science of something very mutable. So here's Hobbes' resolution to this, which you may or may not find particularly satisfying. He goes on and he tells us that, here we go. All men agree upon this, that peace is good, and therefore also the way or means of peace, which are what? The laws of nature. And now he doesn't talk about them as the laws of nature as rules. He says justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and then he says, and the rest of the laws of nature. Now, if a law is strictly speaking a rule, you could say, well, okay, we can interpret this, be just, be equitable, be grateful. But he actually calls these by their names. So they're really not just rules, they are qualities, which he's going to call very shortly virtues, which embody those rules, which are guided by those rules, we could say. And so he tells us these are moral virtues. Their contrary vices are evil. And he tells us the science of virtue and vice is moral philosophy. And therefore, the true doctrine of the laws of nature is the true moral philosophy. So, we've got an interesting identification here. We go from what might be viewed as a deontological, but also consequentialist approach to ethics to what we often call virtue ethics. And there's a lot of discussion about whether Hobbes is indeed a virtue ethicist or not. Most interpreters will say, well, if he is, he's certainly an unusual kind of virtue ethicist. But you notice that he is using a lot of virtue language here, and in a very, very explicit way. So this is what the science of the laws of nature, the true moral philosophy, is actually going to be about. And he's not only going to identify the virtues and vices, he says that what is really important is explaining what makes them good or bad. What makes a virtue, what makes a vice. Now, he's going to not only have done this himself in chapter 14 and 15 with each of the laws of nature, which can then be identified with a particular virtue, right, and also identified against a particular vice. He's also going to criticize other approaches to this. So, for example, the Aristotelian approach. He says, not seeing wherein consisted their goodness, nor that they come to be praised as the means of peaceable, sociable, and comfortable living, they place them in a mediocrity of passions, a middle state, right? The famous Aristotelian mean, as if not the cause, but the degree of daring made fortitude, or not the cause, but the quantity of a gift made liberality. So Hobbes is directly targeting all the Aristotelians out there, and anybody else influenced by Aristotle, who's saying, well, what we want is the right proportion, the right amount, and that the motive is not what's really important. Now, is that a fair representation of Aristotelian virtue ethics? Definitely not. It might be viewed as a fair assessment of the Aristotelians of his time. Hobbes thinks that it's absolutely important that we know why something is a virtue, and he's going to tack it to being a law of nature, being something what a reasonable person can identify as a means for saving their life and not getting themselves in trouble with their fellow citizens, right? Now, he says one other thing here, these dictates of reason men use to call, that is, they're accustomed to call by the name of laws, but improperly, for they are but conclusions or theorems concerning what conduceth to the conservation and defense of themselves. And this is where we sort of foreshadow some interesting issues that are going to arise with some further implications. So the first one is actually in chapter 23. He tells us that those who have the authority to teach or enable others to teach the people their duty to the sovereign power and instruct them in the knowledge of what is just and unjust, right, are public ministers. So this has the implication that anybody who is teaching or assigning other people to teach or, charging them or forbidding them to teach about moral philosophy understood in this proper sense, is actually a public minister. There is no merely private teaching of what we could say Hobbesian virtue ethics consists in. By virtue of teaching about virtues and vices, you are a public minister. Maybe a good one, maybe a bad one, depending on how you're doing that. Chapter 26 deepens the issue in a number of ways. The first thing that we want to look at is that he tells us that the laws of nature aren't really laws unless we are actually in a commonwealth. So he says that the law of nature and the civil law contain each other and are of equal extent. The laws of nature, which consist in equity, justice, gratitude, and other moral virtues, on these, depending in the condition of mere nature, are not properly laws, but qualities that dispose people to peace and to obedience. Once a commonwealth is once settled, then they are actually laws and not before, by being the commands of the commonwealth, therefore also civil laws. It is the sovereign power that obliges people to obey them. And now notice what else he's going to say. In the differences of private men to declare what is equity, what is justice, and what is moral virtue, and to make them binding, this in foro externo, right? There is need of the ordinances of sovereign power and punishments to be ordained for those who will break them. So in a certain sense, this true moral philosophy, this science of the laws of nature, the science of the virtues and vices, it's not really effective unless you've got some sovereign power to back it up and to enforce it. Chapter 26 also includes another interesting discussion here as well. The laws of nature, he tells us, don't actually need publishing or proclamation. Why is that the case? He says, well, they're contained in this one sentence, approved by all the world. Do not that to another which thou thinkest unreasonable to be done by another to thyself. So sometimes it's called the golden rule. Oftentimes this formulation is called the silver rule because it's not do positively to another what you would want done unto you. Don't do to another what you don't want done to you. Well, is Hobbes right about this? Does every single person automatically acknowledge this? That doesn't really seem to be the case. So this would seem to weaken his own point of view, but perhaps there's a reconciliation that's possible. Then we get yet a third interesting implication that Hobbes himself draws out. So he tells us that the interpretation of the laws of nature is something that the sovereign or the sovereign's ministers gets to carry out. And he tells us that it depends not on books of moral philosophy. Who does he have in mind there? Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, commentaries on that, basically everybody else other than Hobbes. So he says that the authority of writers without the authority of the commonwealth makes not their opinion law, be they ever so true. And you might say, well, wait a second, Thomas Hobbes, wouldn't that apply to you? And Thomas Hobbes would say, as a matter of fact, that actually does. Because in the next line, what does he say? That which I have written in this treatise concerning the moral virtues and of their necessity for the procuring and maintaining peace, though it be evident truth, is not therefore presently law, but because in all commonwealths in the world it is part of the civil law. So I have managed to articulate what the true basis of law, moral norms, and civil law ought to be, and that's the reason why my Leviathan can actually be binding on everyone. He says, for though it be naturally reasonable, it is by the sovereign power that it is law. And then he goes on and he says, otherwise it's a great error to call the laws of nature unwritten law, and therefore we see so many volumes published and in them so many contradictions of one another and of themselves. So all the earlier or contemporary books of moral philosophy, contradicting each other, contradicting themselves, they're not actually true. They may contain some truths, but they also have a lot of falsehoods in them. My book is true, but it's not law until it's recognized and instituted by some sort of civil authority, the sovereign, who then decides who's going to teach it and under what conditions it's going to be taught for the interpretation of these laws. So a little bit of a paradoxicality there, right? If this is all true, well, why isn't it automatically binding? Well, Hobbes has an answer to that. You can recognize laws of nature, moral virtues. You can talk meaningfully without contradiction about them in a true way, but you still need some political authority to put them into place and move them from the internal forum of desire to the external forum of action or human behavior. So there really isn't a contradiction there, although it does seem paradoxical. And Hobbes is asserting that, in a kind of self-serving way, perhaps his philosophy that he's laying out for us here in Leviathan is the true and only moral philosophy.